Jacob Ward was a man of the land, a rugged rancher who had spent most of his life alone on the sprawling plains of the American West. His ranch, though not the largest in the area, was a sanctuary for him. With the wide open spaces stretching endlessly before him, Jacob felt at peace. His days were simple. He tended to his cattle, repaired fences, and spent quiet evenings watching the sun dip below the horizon. One late afternoon, as the sun began its descent into the sky, Jacob saddled his horse, preparing to check the farthest corners of his land. The air was crisp, the wind whispering through the tall grasses. It had been a long, hot summer, and Jacob could feel the shift in the air, signaling that the seasons were about to change. As he rode out, his thoughts were far from troubled. The silence of the plains was comforting, and the vast emptiness gave him a sense of freedom. But that peaceful solitude was soon broken by something unexpected. Just beyond the ridge, Jacob spotted something lying motionless on the ground. At first he thought it was an animal, perhaps a stray cow or a deer that had collapsed from the heat. However, as he rode closer, he saw that it was a person lying face down in the dirt. The figure was dressed in simple, worn clothing, and blood stained the earth beneath him. Jacob's heart raced. He quickly dismounted and knelt beside the figure. It was a man, not just any man, but a Native American. His face was battered, his body bruised, and his clothes torn as though he had been through a brutal struggle. Jacob's first instinct was to pull away, to turn his back and leave the stranger there. There had been rumors, stories whispered in the local towns about conflicts between settlers and native tribes. Jacob had heard them, talk of raids, of tensions, of violence. But something inside him told him not to walk away. He gently rolled the man over onto his back and saw the deep gash along the side of his head. The man's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, but it was clear that he needed help, urgent help. Jacob cursed under his breath. There was no time to waste. He knew this man needed medical attention fast, or he might not survive the night. "Come on, old man," Jacob muttered to himself as he lifted the wounded man onto his horse. With great care, he positioned the stranger in front of him, holding him steady as he kicked his horse into a gallop. The journey back to Jacob's ranch wasn't long, but it felt like an eternity. The man's condition seemed to worsen with every passing moment, and Jacob could feel the weight of his decision bearing down on him. He had heard enough about the dangers of getting involved with native tribes. He was no fool. Yet something in his gut told him that helping this man was the right thing to do. When they arrived at the ranch, Jacob dismounted and gently laid the injured man on the ground outside his small cabin. He rushed inside, grabbed his first aid kit, and returned to tend to the man's wounds. He worked quickly, cleaning the cut on the man's head, bandaging his chest, and giving him water to drink. It took hours, but finally the stranger's breathing became steadier, and the fever that had been burning his skin began to subside. Jacob worked through the night, determined not to let the man die under his care. As the first light of dawn broke over the plains, the stranger stirred. His eyes fluttered open, and he looked up at Jacob with a mix of confusion and pain. "Where am I?" the man whispered, his voice weak but still strong. "You're safe," Jacob said, his tone firm but kind. "You're at my ranch. You were hurt pretty badly, but I've taken care of you." The man tried to sit up, but the pain was too much. He winced and lay back down, closing his eyes in exhaustion. "Who are you?" Jacob asked, sitting beside him. The man's eyes opened again, and he fixed his gaze on Jacob. He tried to speak, but his words were slow, as though each one required great effort. "I am Naito, chief of the Akanati tribe," he said, each word carrying the weight of his status. "My people. We have enemies." "I was attacked," Jacob nodded, his mind racing. The Akanati tribe was one of the largest and most powerful in the region. Jacob had heard stories of their fierce warriors and strong leaders. He knew that getting involved with a tribe like this could be dangerous, yet here he was with the chief of the tribe lying in his cabin. "Thank you," Naito whispered, closing his eyes. "You've saved my life." Jacob didn't know what to say. He had no desire for fame or glory, and certainly no interest in getting tangled in tribal conflicts. But in that moment he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of respect for this man, a man who had led his people through countless battles and struggles. "I did what anyone would do," Jacob said, though he wasn't sure if that was true. "You were in trouble. I couldn't just leave you there." Naito smiled weakly, his gratitude evident in his eyes. "You are a good man," he said. Not all people would show such kindness. Jacob didn't know what to say to that. The idea of receiving praise from a tribal leader was foreign to him. He had always been a man of action, not words. As the day wore on, Jacob continued to care for Naito, feeding him and making sure he was as comfortable as possible. He didn't know how long the chief would stay, but he could already sense that this encounter was going to change his life in ways he couldn't yet understand. As evening approached, Jacob went outside to tend to his cattle, his mind still buzzing with the events of the day. He couldn't help but wonder about the future. What would Naito do once he was well? Would he return to his tribe? And what would happen when the chief's people learned that Jacob had saved their leader's life? But those questions could wait. For now, Jacob had done his part. He had helped a man in need, and that was all that mattered. The days that followed were filled with hard work, care, and a deep sense of responsibility for Jacob Ward. As the sun rose over the plains each morning, Jacob would go about his usual routine, feeding the cattle, repairing the fences, and taking care of the ranch. But there was a constant reminder of the wounded man lying in his cabin, recovering under his watchful eye. Jacob knew that helping a stranger was never easy, especially one as important as Chief Naito. The leader of the Akanadi tribe wasn't just anyone. He was a powerful figure, respected by his people and feared by his enemies. To have the chief of a tribe in your care was no small matter. Jacob couldn't help but feel the weight of that responsibility hanging over him. At first, the chief's condition was delicate. His wounds were serious, but Jacob had done everything he could to stabilize him. Naito had a deep gash along his forehead, and his side was bruised from what appeared to be a stab wound. But the chief was a strong man, and Jacob was starting to see that he had the spirit to survive. Slowly, as the days passed, the fever that had once burned brightly within him began to cool, and his strength started to return. Jacob noticed it first when he went to check on Naito one morning. The chief was sitting up in bed, looking out of the small cabin window with a thoughtful expression. He was still pale, his face drawn with exhaustion, but there was a spark in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Good morning," Jacob said as he stepped inside, offering a simple greeting. He placed a tray of food by the bedside, fresh bread, a piece of beef, and some berries. "How are you feeling today?" Naito turned his head slightly and gave a small smile. His voice was weak but growing stronger each day. "Better," he replied, his eyes steady and full of gratitude. "I can feel my strength returning." Jacob was relieved to see the improvement. The healing process had been slow but steady. He'd kept Naito fed and hydrated, and over the course of the last week the chief's wounds had begun to heal. But there was something more happening between them than just the physical recovery. As Naito's strength returned, the two men began talking more. At first it had been simple exchanges, questions about food, water, and the weather. But as the days wore on, their conversations grew deeper. Naito spoke of his tribe, of the ancient customs that had guided his people for generations. He told Jacob about his struggles to keep the tribe safe, how they had always been at odds with other tribes and settlers. He spoke of the land, how the Akanadi had lived in harmony with nature for as long as anyone could remember, and how it was their duty to protect the earth and its resources. Jacob listened closely, fascinated by the stories the chief shared. He had heard tales of Native American tribes before, but hearing them directly from someone who had lived through those challenges was something else entirely. He learned that Naito was not just a warrior but also a leader, a man who carried the weight of his people's future on his shoulders. In return, Jacob told Naito about his life, how he had grown up on a small farm back east, how he had moved west in search of a new life. He explained how he had built the ranch from the ground up, learning the hard way about the difficulties of living on the frontier. Jacob wasn't much of a talker, but in Naito's company he found himself speaking more than he ever had before. There was a comfort in sharing his thoughts with the chief, and a trust that seemed to grow between them. One evening, as the two men sat outside the cabin, watching the orange glow of the setting sun paint the sky, Naito looked over at Jacob and spoke again, his voice calm and reflective. "You know, I've heard many stories about people like you. Settlers who came from far away to claim the land," Naito began, his voice quiet. "Some say that you come to steal what belongs to us. Others believe that you are just looking for a place to call your own. But I have learned something during my time here." Jacob turned to look at him, his brow furrowed in curiosity. "What's that?" "You're not so different from us," Naito said with a small smile. "You too fight for your survival. You too value your land. You care for what you've built, just as we care for our people and our traditions." Jacob hadn't expected such words. He had always viewed Native Americans with a mix of fear and respect, but never thought of them as men and women who shared the same struggles as he did. "You don't look at things the same way," Naito continued, his gaze drifting to the horizon, "but we share the same desires: family, safety, and a place to call home." Jacob sat quietly, reflecting on what the chief had said. In that moment, something inside him shifted. He had always seen life as a series of struggles to be won, one battle after another. But perhaps there was more to it than that. Perhaps it wasn't just about surviving, but about understanding, about connecting with others who had their own struggles, their own hopes and their own dreams. As the days turned into weeks, Naito grew stronger. Jacob continued to care for him, but it was clear that the chief no longer needed constant attention. He was becoming his old self again, albeit a little slower and with a sense of weariness that hadn't been there before. The two men started working together, with Naito offering help with tasks around the ranch. It was small things at first, carrying water, tending to the fire, gathering firewood. But soon Naito was able to do more. His strength had returned, and with it, his spirit. One morning, Jacob woke up early to the sound of laughter coming from the cabin. He stepped outside to find Naito sitting at the table with a small pile of herbs in front of him. The chief was expertly grinding the herbs into a fine powder with a stone, preparing something Jacob couldn't quite recognize. "What's that?" Jacob asked, curious. "A healing balm," Naito explained, his eyes glinting with amusement. "For your sore muscles." "You've been working too hard," Jacob chuckled. "I don't know about that. I feel pretty good." Naito raised an eyebrow, a playful smile on his lips. "You should let me help. A good healer always helps others when they need it." Jacob smiled back, nodding. He had come to appreciate Naito's wisdom and skills over the past few weeks. The chief wasn't just a warrior or a leader. He was a healer in his own right. The ways of his people ran deep in his blood, and Jacob had learned more than he ever expected. As Naito's health continued to improve, Jacob found himself more and more intrigued by the man's culture. He had grown up on the land, living by the rules of settlers, but now he was beginning to see the world through Naito's eyes. It was a world where honor, tradition, and respect for the earth were paramount. Jacob began to wonder what the future held for him and for the chief. Would their bond continue to grow, or would the differences between them eventually pull them apart? But for now, the healing continued. Day by day, Jacob and Naito grew closer, not just as caretaker and patient, but as friends. And in that friendship there was something more. A growing understanding of each other's struggles. A deeper connection between two men from different worlds, but who shared a common desire for peace and respect. The days had turned into weeks, and Jacob Ward was beginning to feel a sense of unease that he hadn't experienced before. Chief Naito's wounds had healed, and he had regained most of his strength. The two men had spent countless hours working side by side, and Jacob had come to appreciate the chief's wisdom and quiet strength. But as the days passed, Jacob felt as though something was about to change. It was a feeling he couldn't shake, one that kept him awake at night. The chief, too, seemed restless. Naito had spoken less and less about the details of his tribe's situation, focusing more on the daily work at the ranch. But Jacob could tell that the man had something on his mind. He had become more distant, his thoughts drifting far away at times. Jacob didn't press him for answers, but he couldn't help but wonder what was going on. Then one morning, everything changed. Jacob had just finished his breakfast when he heard the sound of horses approaching. The rhythm of hooves on the dirt road was unmistakable. He stepped outside, wiping his hands on his pants, ready to greet Naito, who had been out on horseback earlier that morning. But when he looked up, he saw something completely unexpected. Chief Naito was riding at the front of a small group of Native American riders, all of them dressed in traditional clothing. At first, Jacob thought it was a small group of warriors, perhaps sent to check on the chief. But as they drew closer, he saw that the group was not just made up of men. There were 5 women riding alongside them, each one on horseback, looking strong and dignified. Jacob felt a jolt of surprise, his heart racing as he wondered what this could mean. He had heard nothing about Naito bringing anyone with him. The women were beautiful, their faces proud, their eyes full of purpose. Their presence was overwhelming, and for a moment Jacob wasn't sure how to react. When Naito dismounted and approached Jacob, his face was calm, but there was a quiet sense of importance about him. "Jacob," the chief greeted him with a nod. "I bring you a gift." Jacob was still stunned. He had no idea what to make of the situation. "A gift?" he asked, his voice uncertain. He glanced at the women who were now dismounting and standing nearby. Their silence seemed to hold a kind of unspoken power. Naito smiled, his eyes softening. "Yes, a gift," he repeated. "I owe you much. You saved my life, and I have come to honor that. My people have a tradition of showing gratitude in a way that is meaningful." Jacob stood frozen, his mind racing. The chief's words hung in the air, but Jacob couldn't fully understand what was happening. Why was Naito offering him a gift? And what did it mean for these women to be part of it? Before Jacob could ask any more questions, one of the women stepped forward. She was tall and graceful, with dark eyes that held a depth of wisdom. She looked directly at Jacob, offering a respectful bow. "My name is Ayana," she said softly. "I am honored to meet you." Jacob nodded, still unsure of what was happening. I don't understand," he said, glancing at Naito. "What do you mean by a gift?" Naito stepped forward, his expression serious. "These women are part of my tribe, part of our family," he explained. "They have come to you as a sign of respect and gratitude. In our culture, when someone saves the life of a leader, it is customary to offer something in return, a gesture that shows our appreciation." Jacob's heart pounded in his chest. He had never expected anything like this. The idea that Naito would offer these women as a gift was difficult for him to wrap his mind around. What was he supposed to do with them? What were the expectations? Naito continued, "These women are skilled in many things: cooking, weaving, medicine, and farming. They are the heart of our tribe, and they have agreed to come with you and help you in whatever way you need. This is my way of thanking you for saving my life." Jacob felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The gesture, though kind in Naito's eyes, felt overwhelming. It was clear that the chief was offering this gift with the utmost sincerity. But Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't something he could accept lightly. I don't know what to say," Jacob stammered. "This is too much. I didn't do what I did to expect anything in return." Naito's gaze softened. "I understand," he said. "You did not help me for rewards. But our ways are different. We honor those who show kindness, and we repay that kindness in the best way we know how. It is a gesture of respect." Jacob was silent for a long moment. The idea of taking on the responsibility of 5 women was more than he could comprehend. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about the women. It was about the relationship he had formed with Naito, about the bond they had shared over the past weeks. He couldn't deny that he had grown to respect the chief and his people, and in some way, he understood the cultural significance of the gesture. "I'm honored by your offer," Jacob said finally, his voice steady. "But I don't know if I can accept it in the way you intend." Naito nodded slowly, as though he had been expecting this answer. "It is not just about accepting the gift," he said. "It is about the bond we share now. You are not just a stranger anymore. You are a brother. These women are here to help, but they are not property. They are skilled, wise, and free to choose their path. If you accept them into your home, they will offer their help in the spirit of mutual respect." Jacob took a deep breath, trying to process the weight of the situation. He had never asked for anything in return for helping Naito, but he understood that in the world of the Akanati, giving and receiving were part of the balance of life. It was a way of honoring one another, of recognizing the value of both the giver and the receiver. After a long pause, Jacob nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll accept them, but I don't want you to think that this means anything other than what it is, a gesture of respect. I'll do my best to honor your traditions." Naito smiled, a look of satisfaction in his eyes. "That is all I ask." With that, the women stepped forward, each offering a respectful bow before Jacob. He could see the strength in their eyes, the quiet dignity they carried with them. They weren't here as a gift to be possessed, but as individuals with their own stories, their own lives to lead. Jacob knew that this was a responsibility he had to approach with care, and he vowed to honor their presence in his home. As the group prepared to leave, Naito turned to Jacob once more. "Thank you, my friend," he said. "You have earned my respect and the respect of my people. Jacob watched as the chief and his small group of riders disappeared into the distance, leaving the women behind. He felt a strange mix of emotions: gratitude, uncertainty, and a deep sense of responsibility. But one thing was clear: this was the beginning of something new, something unexpected. And as the sun began to set, Jacob realized that the life he had once known was about to change forever. The days that followed Naito's departure were filled with uncertainty. Jacob Ward spent most of his time walking around his ranch, trying to make sense of what had just happened. 5 women had been brought to him as a gift, part of an ancient tradition from the Akanadi tribe, a tribe whose ways he was still trying to understand. He had agreed to accept the women into his home, but what did that really mean? And more importantly, what would the women themselves think of this arrangement? Jacob had never been married. He had lived alone for most of his life, content with his simple routines and solitary lifestyle. The idea of suddenly having 5 women living with him, women who were not only strangers but part of a completely different culture, was a challenge he hadn't expected. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate their skills or value them as individuals. It was just that the situation felt too complex for him to handle easily. Each of the women had her own set of talents. Ayana, the one who had spoken to him first, was skilled in the art of weaving and had already started creating beautiful cloths from the raw materials Jacob had in his barn. Sani, another woman, had a deep knowledge of herbs and healing plants. Jacob watched in amazement as she carefully prepared remedies for the minor cuts and bruises that often came with ranch work. Maya was a cook, and she had begun to prepare hearty meals that filled the ranch with the smells of fresh bread and stews. Tala, a quiet woman with sharp eyes, had already proven her worth by helping Jacob mend the fences, showing an unexpected strength for someone so slender. Lastly, there was Kaya, a woman of few words but a calming presence. She had a way of tending to the animals that Jacob couldn't quite explain, almost as if she could communicate with them in a way he couldn't understand. But despite their skills, Jacob found himself troubled by their presence. They weren't just there to help. They were part of a custom, an offering given to him by Naito. Jacob had always prided himself on being self-sufficient. He had never relied on anyone to help him run the ranch, and now he found himself in a position where he had to rely on others, not out of necessity but because it was expected of him. One evening, as Jacob sat on his porch watching the sun set over the rolling hills, he found himself lost in thought. The women had already gone to their small quarters for the night, and Jacob had a rare moment of peace to reflect on everything that had transpired. What had he gotten himself into? The chief had offered the women as a sign of respect, but Jacob wasn't sure if it was something he truly needed. The ranch had always been his sanctuary, a place where he could control everything. Now there was an added complexity. His home was no longer his own. Jacob's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. He rose and opened it to find Ayana standing there, her dark eyes meeting his with a quiet confidence. "May I speak with you?" she asked softly, her voice gentle but firm. Jacob nodded, stepping aside to let her in. He had always respected Ayana, who had quickly become the most outgoing and outspoken of the women. She was not afraid to speak her mind, something Jacob admired, but it also made him uneasy. He wasn't used to being challenged. Once inside, Ayana sat down across from Jacob, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't seem nervous, but Jacob couldn't help but feel that something important was about to be said. "I want to understand," Ayana began, her voice calm, yet full of meaning. "Why did you accept this gift from the chief? I mean, I know it's a tradition, but I also see that you're not like the others who would have expected such a thing." Jacob stared at her, unsure of how to answer. He had never fully explained why he had agreed to Naito's offer. He had done it because he respected the chief and his culture. But the more time he spent with the women, the more he realized that this gift was becoming more complicated than he had first imagined. "I didn't want to dishonor the chief," Jacob finally said, his voice low. "But I didn't expect it to turn into this." Ayana nodded, her eyes softening. "You didn't ask for us, but we are here now. And I see that you are struggling with this responsibility." Jacob sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what to do. You all have your own lives, your own culture, and here I am just trying to figure it all out. It's not that I don't appreciate what you're doing. It's not what I expected." Ayana remained silent for a moment, considering his words carefully. Then she spoke again, her voice gentle but full of wisdom. "You're not the only one struggling, Jacob. We came here because we respect the chief and we trust him. But we didn't choose this life either. We were part of a tradition, a gesture of respect. But we are not just gifts to be given away." Jacob felt a pang of guilt at her words. He hadn't thought of it that way before. He had been so focused on his own discomfort that he hadn't considered how the women might feel about the arrangement. They had their own lives, their own futures. And now they were all tied to him by a custom they hadn't asked for. "I didn't mean to make you feel like you were," Jacob began, his voice sincere. "I just don't know how to balance everything. I didn't ask for this, but I don't want to disrespect you all either." Ayanna gave him a small, understanding smile. "I know, Jacob, and I don't want you to feel burdened. We can help you, but it has to be because we want to, not because it's expected. This isn't just about fulfilling a role. It's about finding a way to work together." Jacob felt a sense of relief wash over him. Ayanna's words helped him see things from a new perspective. It wasn't just about the tradition, the gift, or the responsibility. It was about the relationship that had developed between him and the women, and between him and Naito. They weren't strangers or obligations. They were people who had become part of his life. "I'll do my best," Jacob said, his voice firm. "But we need to talk about this. We need to understand each other's expectations, mine and yours." Ayanna nodded. "We will. But remember, Jacob, we are not just here to serve you. We are here to share in this life with you, to help where we can, but also to learn from each other." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, thinking about everything Ayanna had said. Slowly, a sense of clarity began to form in his mind. The women weren't just here as part of some tradition. They were here to create something new. They could work together, not out of obligation, but out of respect and mutual understanding. As the night drew on, Jacob felt a shift within himself. The dilemma he had been facing wasn't as simple as accepting or rejecting the gift. It was about accepting responsibility in a way that respected both their cultures, their lives, and their shared future. And for the first time since Naito had brought them to his ranch, Jacob felt a sense of peace. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow across the ranch as Jacob stood at the edge of the field, his thoughts heavy with the weight of what had happened. The days since Naito had left with his riders had been filled with a new sense of balance, one that Jacob hadn't expected. The 5 women, each with their own skills and strengths, had settled into life at the ranch, but it wasn't just about the work they did. It was about the growing bond between them all. Over the past few weeks, Jacob had come to realize something important. The women were not just helping him out of obligation. They were part of something bigger, something that connected their worlds in ways he had never imagined. And in their own way, they had become a part of his life. Not just as helpers, but as individuals with their own hopes, dreams, and desires. And Jacob had spent countless hours with each of them, talking, learning, and trying to understand their perspectives. He had seen Ayanna weave beautiful cloths in the mornings, Sana tending to the herbs and plants that had become a staple in their meals, Maya cooking hearty meals that filled the ranch with delicious smells, Tala working tirelessly with the cattle, and Kaya quietly observing the land and animals, always with a calm sense of purpose. They had all found their places at the ranch, contributing in their own ways. But Jacob also saw the restlessness in their eyes. He understood now that they didn't see themselves as mere gifts, as things to be given away. They were here because they had been chosen, and in a way they had chosen him too. But Jacob had come to a crossroads. The bond he had formed with these women was real, but it was also complicated. He couldn't ignore the reality that the world they came from was different from his own. The relationship between settlers and Native Americans was fraught with tension and misunderstanding. Jacob knew that the chief's gesture had been a sign of respect, but now he had to decide how to move forward. What did he want from this new chapter in his life? Was it enough to let things remain as they were? Or did he need to make a decision about the future of the ranch and the women who had become a part of it? One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jacob sat on the porch, a warm breeze ruffling his hair. The women had gone about their work, and for the first time in days, Jacob felt a sense of solitude. The ranch felt peaceful, but there was still something missing. He had spent so much time thinking about the women, about Naito's gift, about the expectations that had been placed on him. But he had never stopped to think about his own feelings, his own desires. He thought back to when he first met Naito, to the day he had found the chief lying injured on the side of the road. Jacob had been alone then, just as he was now. He had always believed that he didn't need anyone. But helping Naito, taking him in, had shown him that there was more to life than just surviving. There was connection, there was honor, and there was respect for others. But there was also something else, the need for a sense of belonging, of family. And that, Jacob realized, was what he had found with the women. Jacob had learned to appreciate their presence. He had learned that they weren't just there to fill a role, they were part of something larger than himself. But he also knew that they were free to make their own choices, free to live their own lives. And in that freedom, Jacob had to ask himself, what did he truly want for the future? He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Ayana approaching, her face calm. But there was something in her eyes that told him she had been thinking the same things. "Jacob," she said softly, sitting beside him on the porch. "We need to talk." Jacob nodded, his stomach tightening. "I know," he replied, his voice low. "I've been thinking about everything. About the ranch, about you and the others. I don't want you all to feel like you're just here because of some old tradition." Ayana looked at him with a quiet understanding. "We know that. We never thought of ourselves as gifts, Jacob. But we also know that this is not a simple situation. We don't belong to you and you don't belong to us. We are here because we chose to be." Jacob's heart skipped a beat. He had known this on some level, but hearing Ayana speak those words made everything feel more real. She was right. They weren't here to fulfill an obligation. They were here because they had decided to be part of his life, just as he had become a part of theirs. "I didn't ask for any of this," Jacob said, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't expect any of it. But I've come to realize that I don't want to lose what we've built here." Ayana smiled softly, placing a hand on his arm. "You don't have to lose it, Jacob. But you also don't have to do everything alone. We are here because we want to be, and we're not asking for anything more than to be part of something real. A family, maybe. Not out of duty, but out of choice." Jacob felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in a long while, he felt as though he wasn't carrying the burden of the world on his own. Ayana's words had cut through the confusion, the doubts, and the fears. They were all part of this together, and that was enough. "What do you mean, a family?" Jacob asked, his voice soft. Ayana's eyes glistened in the fading light. "A family isn't just about blood or tradition. It's about connection, about care. We have a chance to create something here, something that goes beyond what was expected, a place where we all belong." Jacob nodded, feeling the truth in her words. This wasn't just about him, and it wasn't just about them. It was about something bigger, a bond that could transcend cultures, differences, and expectations. It was about building a future, one that was shaped by respect, understanding, and choice. "We can do that," Jacob said, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "We can build something new together." Ayana smiled in return, her eyes warm. "We've already started, Jacob, and we'll keep going, one step at a time." The two of them sat there in comfortable silence as the last light of day faded into night. Jacob felt a sense of peace settle over him, a peace that had eluded him for so long. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time he felt ready to face it, no longer alone, but with the support of the women who had come into his life in such an unexpected way. As the stars appeared in the sky above, Jacob realized that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would not always be easy, but with the people around him, with the women who had become more than just guests on his ranch, he was ready to face whatever came next. And in that moment, Jacob knew that he had found what he had been searching for all along, a family, a place to belong, and a future full of possibilities.